Mosquitos over Amiens, the raid that shook the walls of injustice operation. Jericho, February 18, 1944. Winter lay heavy across the plains of northern France in the opening months of 1944, a cold and cruel reminder of a world at war. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and defeat, of occupation and quiet desperation. In the ancient town of Amiens, cobblestone streets were shrouded in frost, their narrow alleys muffling the sound of war that raged elsewhere. Snow fell silently onto shuttered windows and iron fences, cloaking everything in a brittle, deceptive calm. The once vibrant heart of the region now pulsed with caution and fear. German boots echoed down alleys that once rang with laughter. Now conversations were hushed, eyes glanced sideways, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. The people of Amiens carried on with the facade of normal life, bartering in the open-air market, tending to small shops, attending mass, but always beneath watchful eyes. Swastikas fluttered from official buildings. Gestapo agents strolled openly, their long coats cutting like razors through the streets. Somewhere between the soft toll of the church bells and the creak of bicycle wheels over frozen stone, an invisible thread held everything in tense suspension. It was the thread of resistance, thin, fragile, yet unbroken. At the edge of town, crouched beneath the weight of winter and dread, stood the Amiens Prison. Built like a fortress of old, with thick stone walls and a gray slate roof that disappeared into the murky sky, it looked more like a medieval bastion than a modern penitentiary. Inside, the air was colder still, dank, foul, and thick with the smell of mildew and misery. Over 700 men and women were confined within its cells, packed behind iron bars and locked doors. Most were ordinary prisoners. But 120 were not. They were members of the French resistance, fighters, messengers, saboteurs, and couriers, the beating heart of the underground war against Nazi tyranny. They had been betrayed, captured, tortured. Now they waited. Some stared into the gray light of dawn through barred windows, eyes hollow. Others whispered in the shadows, trading fragments of hope, names of comrades, coded phrases. Their bravery was palpable, their silence absolute. These were the men and women who had risked everything, homes, families, futures, to defy the Reich. For many, execution was certain. The Gestapo had already drawn up lists. Time was no longer measured in hours, but in cigarettes smoked, footsteps heard in the hall, meals left untouched. Across the English Channel, the British knew what was coming. Deep beneath the streets of London, inside the war rooms of Whitehall, analysts and operatives pored over intercepted messages. MI6 and the Special Operations Executive's French section had cracked parts of the code. The Gestapo was preparing to extract everything from the captured resistance members: locations of safe houses, names of Allied spies, sabotage plans, and even details that could jeopardize the looming Allied invasion of France. If these secrets fell into German hands, the entire resistance network in northern France could be annihilated. D-Day itself could be compromised before it began. There was no time for bureaucracy. There was no room for second chances. Every delay meant death. For the prisoners, for the network, for the war effort. MI6 knew it. The RAF knew it. The French resistance knew it. In the depths of winter, under a sky that seemed to press lower with each passing day, there was only one option left. They would have to break them out, not with whispers, not with diplomacy, but with thunder and fire. Because if the Nazis succeeded in breaking the prisoners, they would destroy the resistance from within. But if the Allies could get to them first, if they could blow open the very walls of Amiens Prison, then those secrets might be saved. So might the souls who held them. The decision was made, plans were drawn, and somewhere in the darkness, a flight crew checked their watches. The mission was on. The plan, even on paper, read like madness. It was the kind of operation conjured in desperation, one with odds so slim they bordered on fantasy. The Royal Air Force had launched daring missions before, but this one would demand near-perfect execution. The objective? Strike at the very heart of the Nazi occupation's cruelty. Amiens Prison. The method? Fly straight into the jaws of enemy territory in broad daylight, skimming just above the treetops, barely higher than the steeples of sleepy French churches, low enough that the frost-covered hedgerows would blur beneath the wingtips. The bombers would have to navigate flak batteries, German fighter patrols, and unpredictable winter winds, not to mention the all-consuming fog of war. And when they arrived, they would have to strike with a surgeon's precision, blow the outer prison walls wide open, obliterate the guard towers and administrative buildings, and then get out, fast. All of this without harming the prisoners inside. No second runs, no mistakes. Failure meant catastrophe. Success? A miracle. This was not a mission for heavy bombers or lumbering gunships. This demanded something different, something fast, agile, deadly, and above all, precise. The kind of aircraft that could dart through valleys and duck under radar screens like a hawk hunting in a canyon. For this mission, there was only one aircraft in the Allied arsenal that could possibly pull it off. It was called the de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito. Nicknamed the Wooden Wonder, the Mosquito was unlike anything else in the skies. While most aircraft were forged from steel and aluminum, the Mosquito was crafted largely from molded plywood, a decision that initially drew ridicule, but soon earned respect and admiration. Its construction made it light, strong, and surprisingly stealthy to radar. Beneath its sleek fuselage, two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, siblings to those that powered the iconic Spitfire, roared with restrained fury, propelling the aircraft to speeds few could match. It could fly low and fast, threading through the narrowest of gaps between terrain and treetop. It was as much a scalpel as it was a hammer, ideal for a mission that required both destruction and delicacy. In addition to its impressive speed, the Mosquito could carry a significant payload. For Operation Jericho, the bombers would be armed with 500-pound explosives and .303 Browning machine guns, more than enough to blast through reinforced walls and silence any response from German guards. But more than the firepower, it was the aircraft's ability to hug the landscape, to become one with the very contours of France, that made it the RAF's choice. This would be a mission of seconds and inches, of split-second decisions and margin-of-error calculations. If the bombers flew too high, they'd be torn apart by flak. Too low, and they risked crashing into the prison or nearby buildings. Each aircraft had to fly in formation, in silence, and with deadly purpose. The operation had a name, Operation Jericho, a biblical nod to the ancient city whose walls were brought down by trumpets and divine will. This time, it would be bombs and bravery. At the head of the formation was Group Captain Charles Pickard, one of the most respected and admired pilots in the Royal Air Force. He was no stranger to danger. With his chiseled features, calm demeanor, and a reputation for leading from the front, Pickard inspired loyalty in every man who flew under his command. He had the look of a storybook hero, square-jawed and blue-eyed, with a quiet resolve that reassured even in the most turbulent moments. His service record was the stuff of legend. He had flown over 100 combat missions, many of them under fire, often staying behind to shepherd wounded planes back home. He wasn't just a leader, he was a protector. At his side, as always, was his trusted navigator, Flight Lieutenant John Bill Broadley. A man of precision and discipline, Broadley had a mind like a compass, sharp, instinctive, and always pointing true. He and Pickard had flown countless missions together, developing an unspoken rhythm, a bond forged through flak storms and fire. They trusted each other with their lives, and on this mission, that trust would be tested more than ever before. As the details of Operation Jericho solidified, both men understood the stakes. They were not merely bombing a prison. They were offering a chance at life to more than 100 resistance fighters who had risked everything for freedom. But they were also accepting the risk of failure, of death, and of killing the very people they were trying to save if even a single bomb fell off target. It was a knife-edge operation, part rescue, part reckoning. Pickard and Broadley didn't hesitate. Their courage was quiet, almost resigned. They knew that if anyone could thread the needle, it would be the crews of the Mosquito squadrons, and they knew that if they had to sacrifice their own lives to give others a chance, they would do so without question. This was what the war had demanded of them: daring, sacrifice, and a heart full of purpose. As dawn approached on February 18, 1944, the pilots made their final checks. Engines warmed, maps were folded and tucked into flight jackets, coordinates were committed to memory. The weight of the mission pressed down like the overcast sky, heavy and unrelenting. Pickard, calm as ever, adjusted his gloves, glanced at Broadley, and gave a small nod. There was nothing left to say. The Mosquito engines roared to life, shattering the stillness of the British countryside as the formation taxied to the runway. Operation Jericho had begun, and with it, a prayer soared into the skies over Europe, made not of words, but of wood, speed, and flame. A biting wind cut across the airfield at RAF Hunsdon, slicing through the chill morning air like a razor. Frost clung to the wings of the de Havilland Mosquito bombers lined up in tight formation on the tarmac. 14 aircraft in all, assigned to number 140 wing of the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force. Each aircraft bore the load of silent gravity, literal and symbolic. Nestled under their bellies were 500-pound bombs, finely tuned for maximum impact. But these weren't just instruments of destruction. They were scalpels meant to slice open the concrete shell of Amiens Prison with surgical precision. Every rivet in those wooden fuselages, every dial in the cockpit, was about to be tested in what many deemed a suicide mission. The crews stood quietly by their aircraft in leather jackets and sheepskin boots, faces tight with focus and the grim acceptance of what lay ahead. The mission briefing echoed in their minds. A 170-mile flight into occupied France at treetop level, beneath the lethal sweep of German radar, across flak zones and along river valleys watched by enemy spotters. It would require nerve, exactitude, and perhaps the impossible. They had studied the maps, memorized the contours of the terrain, the timing, the altitude, the precise second each bomb would be released. They drilled to perfection, yet still, uncertainty loomed like a fog around them. Then came the first roar, low, guttural, powerful. The lead Mosquito surged forward, its twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines screaming as it devoured the runway. Wheels up. The machine leapt into the sky like a hawk taking flight, followed one by the rest of the wing. They banked hard over Hertfordshire's green fields, racing southeast toward the English Channel, flying so low their prop wash stirred dust from farm roads and startled livestock. As the formation pressed on, they became a phantom fleet, neither seen nor heard by most civilians below, yet humming with deadly purpose. Over the Channel, the water stretched calm and gray, deceptive in its peace. Beneath them, the waves were indifferent to the men passing above, men who carried not just bombs, but the weight of history. The Mosquitoes thundered across the sea, engines maintaining a tight harmony as pilots kept their altitudes within feet of one another. Flying so low and fast, the margin for error was razor thin. One lapse in concentration and disaster would come not from flak or fighters, but from the earth itself. They weren't alone. Racing ahead, weaving a path through enemy-occupied France, were RAF Typhoon fighter bombers, tasked with stirring chaos and confusion among German defenses. They strafed railway lines, barracks, and checkpoints, lighting the way with fire and fury. The distraction was essential. The Mosquitos would have no time to defend themselves. Their best protection was speed, surprise, and the precision of a knife-edge plan. France unfolded beneath them, snow-flecked villages, frozen streams, bare hedgerows. Pilots flew so low they could see laundry drying on lines, children waving in surprise, farmers frozen in place by the rush of sound and motion overhead. These fleeting glimpses of civilian life made the stakes feel even heavier. This was no abstract battlefield. This was their land, their people, and at the center of it all, Amiens. As the River Somme twisted through the countryside, visibility began to falter. Mist curled up from the water like smoke, obscuring landmarks and threatening to swallow the mission whole. In the cockpits, navigators adjusted their compasses and recalculated bearings with steely focus. There could be no mistakes now. Then they saw it. Amiens Prison, gray, monolithic and grim, encircled by high stone walls and flanked by German guard towers. It looked like a fortress, more than a jail, cold and impregnable. But inside those walls were over 700 prisoners, many innocent, many brave, and 120 marked for execution. Some had been tortured. Some had already confessed under duress. If the Germans completed their interrogations, the resistance across northern France could crumble. For those inside the prison, it was just another morning of dread. Some sat in silence. Some prayed. Some listened to the faint, eerie quiet beyond the walls. They had no idea that at that very moment, salvation was screaming toward them on wooden wings. The bombers dipped lower still. Pickard's Mosquito opened the run. Like arrows loosed from a divine bow, the bombers descended. Flying at just 50 feet, they raced over the frozen fields. Local farmers dropped their tools. Children pointed. German soldiers scrambled. But it was too late. The first wave of bombs slammed into the outer wall of the prison. Stone exploded outward. Dust clouded the air. Seconds later, a second wave hit the guardhouse, obliterating it in a thunderclap of fire and steel. Then came the most dangerous part, timing the third wave to delay just enough to allow prisoners to escape the damaged buildings before collapsing more walls. The Mosquitos circled again, dropped the final bombs, and strafed nearby German vehicles. Machine guns barked from the air. Explosions rocked the countryside. From the prison yard, screams and cries echoed. The mission had lasted just 8 minutes. In the aftermath of the bombing, the once imposing Amiens prison stood shattered and broken. Its high stone walls, designed to confine and intimidate, now lay torn open, gaping like a wound in the heart of occupied France. Smoke curled from collapsed guard towers, and dust choked the air. The rhythmic pounding of bombs had given way to silence, punctuated only by the crackling of fires and the distant screams of wounded guards and fleeing prisoners. What moments earlier had been a fortress of hopelessness was now a crucible of chaos, confusion, and, most astonishingly, liberation. Through the twisted remains of steel gates and rubble-strewn courtyards, dozens of prisoners surged forward, stumbling, limping, crawling, any way they could, toward freedom. Some blinked in disbelief as the sunlight hit their eyes for the first time in months. Others paused only to orient themselves before disappearing into the surrounding countryside. Gunfire echoed behind them, and the frantic cries of German guards called for order, but it was too late. The breach had been made. The cages had opened. Among the escapees were men and women whose names would never be known, those who slipped quietly into the resistance once more, fading into the forests and cities of France to carry on the fight. Some had been tortured into silence. Some had been on the brink of execution. Now, covered in soot and sweat, they ran not only for their lives, but for their country's future. Cloaked in the smoke of bomb-blasted stone, they vanished into freedom like ghosts reborn. The breakout was not without cost. The chaos that accompanied liberation spared no one. Some prisoners, disoriented or injured, wandered aimlessly and were quickly recaptured by regrouping German forces. Others were gunned down in the prison yard, caught in the deadly crossfire of panicked guards and falling debris. In those agonizing minutes, the line between salvation and tragedy was razor thin. Yet against all odds, over 250 prisoners made it out. 250 souls, many of them crucial figures within the French resistance, coordinators, couriers, saboteurs, people whose knowledge and courage would soon become indispensable to the success of the Allied invasion. These weren't just inmates fleeing a prison. They were the arteries of a nation's fight for liberation, now back in motion. But even as the mission achieved its purpose, the shadow of sacrifice loomed overhead. Far above the carnage, the de Havilland Mosquitos turned for home, engines strained but steady, their bellies empty of bombs and their crews heavy with the weight of what they had just done. The low-altitude run had taken them through a gauntlet of enemy fire, past flak bursts and machine gun tracers that lit the sky like angry stars. The retreat, though brief, would prove to be just as deadly as the approach. Group Captain Charles Pickard, the man who had led the operation with quiet conviction and unshakable resolve, flew in the rear. With him was his trusted navigator, Flight Lieutenant Bill Broadley, a companion through countless missions, bound now to his fate. Their Mosquito, battered from the run, traced a careful arc through the sky. Perhaps they had a moment of reflection, perhaps not. But within the cockpit, as dials flickered and the wind howled past shattered canopy glass, they must have known the danger hadn't passed. It struck swiftly. A lone Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's deadliest single-engine fighters, rose into view like a hawk spotting prey. Its pilot, trained to pounce, took position behind the Mosquito. A flash of fire from its cannons followed, a burst that stitched death across the tail of Pickard's aircraft. The Mosquito bucked violently. Smoke poured from its engines. For a brief second, it fought to hold altitude, wings flapping like the last breaths of a dying bird. Then, in a sudden twist of fate, it lost its fight with gravity. Witnesses on the ground saw the plane spiral downward, its frame ablaze, black smoke trailing behind like a mournful banner. It slammed into a snow-dusted field with a deafening thud, breaking apart on impact. There was no chance of survival. The bodies of Pickard and Broadley, once brothers of the sky, now lay still amid the wreckage, martyrs to a mission whose success came at the highest price. They had made it to the target. They had struck with precision. They had saved hundreds of lives and altered the course of a covert war within the war. But they would not return home. Back at RAF Hunsdon, their empty parking spot on the flight line was the only evidence of what had been lost. No radio call, no farewell, just silence. Pickard, humble, brave, never one to seek glory, had always known the risks. Broadley, steadfast, sharp, and loyal, had always followed where duty called. Their deaths. Escape and sacrifice. In the chaos, dozens of resistance prisoners fled through the smoldering ruins. Some were recaptured, some were killed. But over 250 prisoners escaped that day, many of them key members of the resistance, who would later assist the Allies in preparations for D-Day. Inside the smoke and rubble of the retreating bombers, tragedy struck. As Pickard's Mosquito turned back, a FW-190 German fighter intercepted him. A burst of cannon fire tore through the tail. The aircraft shuddered, spiraled, and crashed into a field. Both Pickard and Broadley were killed, martyrs of precision and duty. They had completed the mission, but they would not return home. The aftermath and legacy operation. Jericho stunned the Germans. Not only had the Allies dared to strike a prison so deep in occupied France, they had done so with surgical accuracy. The Luftwaffe, caught off guard, scrambled too late. The SS and Gestapo, humiliated, searched the countryside for escapees, many of whom slipped through the cracks and rejoined the fight. The cost was steep. 3 Mosquitos were shot down, 11 airmen died, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. To the resistance, Jericho was a thunderbolt of hope. Word spread quickly. The British had not forgotten. They would risk anything to protect their own. In post-war years, survivors spoke of the raid in reverent tones. One prisoner recalled hearing, "The walls breathe fire," and knowing at once that salvation had come from the sky. For the older soul who remembers sacrifice, for the generation who lived through the war, who knew the weight of silence and the price of freedom, Operation Jericho is more than a story. It is a symbol of courage forged not just in battle, but in compassion. Of warriors who dared to fly lower, faster, and closer, not to destroy cities, but to save the brave souls within prison walls. A reminder that in the darkest winter of war, light can still break through. Sometimes it comes not from heaven, but from the wings of men who believed in something greater than themselves.